This is Serial Killers and How to Spot Them by Hannah Ray, Louise Sharp, and Caricia Vanterpool. Offender profiling is a technique for identifying the major personality and behavioural characteristics of an individual based upon the analysis of the crimes he or she has committed. After interviews with 25 murderers and 11 sexual murderers, organised and disorganised typologies were developed. After examining 110 more serial killers, it was found that 37 characteristics were exhibited by murderers. Disorganised killers have an average or below average IQ, mental disorders, and very antisocial. They're extremely dangerous due to striking at random moments. They take no steps to attempt to cover up the crime. They are disconnected from their family and friends, and they don't venture far from their homes when killing. An example of this type of killer is Richard Trenton Chase, aka Vampire Killer of Sacramento. He drank the victim's blood and used their body parts to intake cannabis. He ate animals raw and blended them and injected himself with rabbit's blood in '76. Once released from the hospital, he shot and killed Ambrose Griffin. Police discovered Trace resided within a mile of the murder sites. Organised killers are meticulous, with contingency plans in place to clean up after themselves. They make sure nothing is left behind and every precaution is taken so that they will not be found. An example of this type of killer is John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown. He raped, tortured, and killed 33 young boys and young men between 72 and 78. He dug the graves for his victims before he killed them, and 27 of those were buried under his house. He confessed to the murders after 2 weeks of surveillance. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Mixed killers share characteristics of both disorganised and organised types, as they don't fit one category. They don't give a pattern, and there is usually a large amount of physical violence towards the victim due to panic. An example of this type of killer is Richard Ramirez. He killed 19 people between June 1984 and September 1985. He casually murdered his victims in their home, where he overcame them with a wild, offensive attack. Power or control killers want dominance and power over their victim. Extending the process of killing provides more enjoyment for the killer. Typically includes torture, restraint, and dismembering. Again, another example of this is John Wayne Gacy. Hedonistic comfort killers. They are often referred to as Black Widow killers, as many women fall into this category. Victims tend to be family members for monetary gain. An example of this type of killer is Harold Shipman. He's estimated to have killed 215 to 250 people. He falsely diagnosed his patients with cancer and treated them with diamorphine. He signed the death certificates claiming that old age was the cause of death. He forged wills and made him the sole beneficiary. Hedonistic lust killers require intimate skin-to-skin contact with their killings. They're often highly organised in their crimes and fantasise extensively about murder, and they may rehearse it in their minds for years before actually committing the murder. They are arguably the most terrifying and barbaric of all. An example of this type of killer is Jeffrey Dahmer. He obsessively fantasised about the perfect lover. This obsession led him to murder and cannibalise 17 men and boys between 78 and 91. He disembodied the heads and genitals of his victims and preserved them in specimen jars. He ingested human flesh of his victims as trophies. Hedonistic thrill killers kill for pleasure and excitement. They take time in their killings to gain more pleasure, and there's evidence of torture, rape, and strangulation. An example of this type of killer is the Zodiac Killer. He was active in the late 60s and early 70s. In his letters to newspaper, he claims to have killed 37 people, and he states that when he dies, he believes that he will be reborn in a paradise with his victims as his slaves. Mission-oriented killers target specific victims who they view as evil. They seek to improve the world according to their own bias and self-serving standards. They're likely to be perfectionist and highly compulsive. They plan their killings with great precision and to kill quickly and efficiently, and their victims should be grateful that the killer has chosen them to be selected for termination. An example of this type of killer is Joseph P. Franklin. He was a former member of the KKK and was convicted of 4 homicides in 1980. Visionary killers respond to delusional voices of which they believe to be real, that instruct them to commit murder. They typically experience a psychotic break that leads them to commit murder. They don't have an ideal type they seek out. The murderous agenda is entirely synchronized. They almost always fall into the disorganized category of FBI profiling. An example of this type of killer is Herbert Mullin. He murdered 13 people in the early 70s. He believed that killing people would delay a potential earthquake that would supposedly plunge California into the ocean. Once interviewed in prison, it was concluded that he was a paranoid schizophrenic. Limitations of the FBI's profiling technique are as follows: little peer-reviewed information due to it being tightly controlled by the FBI, little to no research on comparisons of profiles before and after offender was caught, and there's a large overlap between categories. For example, John Wayne Gacy is both organised and power control killer.